The night Edna Calloway nearly froze her youngest child to death, she was doing everything right. That is the part that haunts you when you dig into stories like hers. She was not careless. She was not lazy. She was not poor in the way people today think of poor, where poor means you failed somehow. She was poor the way half of rural Ohio was poor in 1942, which means she was doing everything a person could possibly do with what she had, and it still almost was not enough. The wood stove in the corner of the main room had been burning since sundown. The quilts on the bed were 3 layers deep, and she had sewn 2 of them herself from flour sacks and old wool coats that had given up their usefulness in every other way. The window had cardboard tacked inside the glass, which cut the draft by maybe half. She had done everything right. And still, when she went to check on her 4-year-old son Thomas at 2 in the morning, his lips had gone the color of a bruise. That night changed the way the Calloway family slept for the next 11 winters, and Edna was far from alone. Across the rural American Midwest and Appalachia and the Upper South, stretching from the hill country of Kentucky all the way north to the dairy farms of Wisconsin and Minnesota, there was a practice that almost nobody talks about anymore because the people who lived it are mostly gone now, and the people who came after them moved into houses with central heating and forgot that there was ever a problem to solve in the first place. Farm families slept sitting up. Not all of them, not every night, not in every region, but enough of them, and consistently enough, and for reasons grounded so deeply in practical survival that once you understand it, you cannot look at an old farmhouse bedroom the same way again. This is the story of why they did it, how they did it, what it cost them, and what it saved. It starts with the cold, which means it starts with the houses. A farmhouse built in 1910 or 1920 in rural Indiana or Tennessee or Missouri was not built the way we think of houses being built today. There was no insulation in the walls in the modern sense. There was no vapor barrier, no sealed envelope, no engineered airflow system. What there was, in most cases, was a wood frame covered with boards, sometimes covered with clapboard siding on the outside, and on the inside either bare boards or plaster over lath. That was the wall. That was it. In a good house, someone might have stuffed old newspaper or sawdust between the interior and exterior walls. In a great house, there might be brick on the exterior for thermal mass. In most houses, there was neither. The gaps in these walls were not subtle. Old farmhouses breathed. They leaked air at the windows, at the doors, at the floor where the boards had shrunk and warped over decades, at the ceiling where the plaster had cracked. On a night when the temperature outside dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature inside a room with no fire burning would drop to within 10 or 15 degrees of outside by morning. If you left a glass of water on the windowsill in a bedroom that had no heat source, it would freeze solid before dawn. Bedrooms, almost universally, had no heat source. This was not an oversight. In most rural farmhouses, the layout was deliberate. You had 1 or 2 main rooms that were heated, the kitchen and perhaps a sitting room, and then the bedrooms were separate and cold. The reason for this was practical. Wood was expensive to cut, expensive to haul, expensive to manage, and a fire left unattended in a sleeping room was a legitimate danger. Houses burned down. They burned down constantly in rural America through the first half of the 20th century. The idea of keeping a fire burning all night in an unattended bedroom was not considered a reasonable thing to do. So the bedrooms were cold, and people figured out how to survive the cold bedrooms. And one of the things they figured out was a particular way of sleeping. But before we get to that, you have to understand what the cold actually does to a sleeping body. When you lie flat in a very cold room, several things happen that are not obvious unless you have lived through them. The first is that cold air settles. It is denser than warm air, and it drops. The coldest layer of air in a cold room is always the layer closest to the floor, and the warmest layer, relatively speaking, is the layer near the ceiling. The difference between floor level and ceiling level in a poorly insulated farmhouse bedroom on a cold night could be as much as 15 or 20 degrees. A person sleeping on a low bed or on a mattress on the floor, which was common in households with many children and not enough beds, was sleeping in the coldest possible layer of air in the coldest possible room in the house. The second thing that happens is that cold air, when breathed continuously for hours, creates specific problems in the lungs and airways. The mucous membranes in the nose and throat dry out and become less effective as filters. In people who already had any kind of chest weakness, which in rural America in this era meant anyone who had ever had tuberculosis or whooping cough or any of the respiratory illnesses that moved through farming communities with devastating regularity. Sleeping flat in cold air made those conditions worse. There is a reason that sanatoriums of the early 20th century, which were treating tuberculosis patients, had their patients sleep in tilted beds or sit up in bed. There is a reason that old nursing home practices, even into the 1960s, kept patients with respiratory conditions semi-reclined. The angle mattered. Sleeping at an angle, even a slight one, changes how the lungs drain, changes how mucus moves, reduces the pooling of fluid in the lower lobes of the lungs that cold and illness and lying flat all conspire to create. The third thing, and perhaps the most immediately dangerous for small children, is the relationship between body mass, surface area, and heat retention. A small child loses heat faster than an adult, pound for pound, because they have more surface area relative to their body mass. A 4-year-old lying flat on a cold bed in a cold room can lose body heat at a rate that will bring them to the threshold of hypothermia before dawn without anyone realizing it is happening, because the onset of moderate hypothermia in a sleeping child looks to the eye like deep sleep. The child is not shivering. The child is not crying. The child is still. The child is in serious danger. Edna Callaway knew none of this in medical terms. She knew it the way farm women knew most things, which was through experience, through what her mother had told her, and through what had happened to people she knew. Edna's mother was a woman named Ruth, who had grown up in southeastern Ohio near the town of Caldwell in the hill country, where winters came hard off the ridges and the farmhouses were old and drafty in ways that would make a modern building inspector weep. Ruth had lost a younger brother to what the family called lung fever in the winter of 1908. He was 3 years old. He had been perfectly healthy in October. By February he was gone, and the family always said afterward that the cold sleeping room was part of what took him. Whether that was medically accurate or not, they believed it, and the belief changed how they did things. Ruth's family, after the death of that little boy, began doing what a number of families in that part of Ohio did. In the deepest part of winter, from roughly December through February, they reorganized sleep. The youngest children, those under about 6 years old, did not sleep in the cold bedrooms. They slept in the main room, near the stove, in whatever configuration made sense. Sometimes that meant a pallet on the floor near the heat. Sometimes it meant the children sleeping in the main bed while the adults slept in chairs. Sometimes it meant the whole family, parents included, sitting up through the coldest nights rather than lying down in rooms where the temperature would drop to dangerous levels. Sitting up was not merely a preference. For many families it was what the architecture demanded. A farmhouse with one adequate heat source, and 6 or 8 people needed to concentrate those people near the heat source in winter. And the seating available near the heat source was chairs, rocking chairs, straight-backed kitchen chairs with homemade cushions tied to them, wooden settles built against the wall near the fireplace, which in Appalachian homes often ran along the entire length of one wall and could seat 3 or 4 people comfortably enough for sleeping. Church pews that had been acquired from congregations that had closed or rebuilt. All of these were places where people sat, and in winter where people slept while sitting. The technique was not random. It was refined over generations to be as comfortable and effective as possible, which is not the same as comfortable in any absolute sense, but which worked. Here is how a farm family in, say, eastern Kentucky or western North Carolina or the hill country of southern Illinois would have organized a cold winter night in the 1930s and 1940s. The stove would be loaded heavy before bed. Not the careful, economical fire of daytime, but a real load of the densest wood available. Split oak if you had it, hedge apple or Osage orange if you were in the right part of the country. Anything with high BTU content that would hold a coal through the night. Some families had the luxury of a coal-burning stove, and coal held overnight better than most would. But coal cost money, and many families were burning entirely what they cut themselves. The fire was loaded, damped down to burn slow, and then the family arranged themselves. The oldest and most cold-hardy adults, typically the father and the older boys, might actually go to the cold bedrooms and sleep in the beds. Their body mass and their quilts were sufficient in most winters, and somebody needed to use the beds. But the mother, especially if she was nursing an infant, and all the small children, would stay in the main room. The children who were old enough to sit up would be placed in chairs or on the settle wrapped in quilts, and positioned so that they were angled away from direct drafts, but within the radius of warmth from the stove. A child in a rocking chair with a quilt wrapped from chin to toes, head against the back of the chair, and a rolled piece of cloth or a feed sack pillow tucked behind the neck, could sleep adequately in this position for a full night. Was it the deep, restorative sleep of a warm bed? No. But it kept the child warm. It kept the child's airway at an angle that drained rather than pooled, and it kept the child alive. Infants were handled differently. An infant in a cold night was the gravest concern, and the solution was the most intimate one available, which was body heat. Mothers held infants against their chests through the night, and in the sitting position, with the mother in a rocking chair, and the infant tucked inside the mother's outer clothing, or wrapped tight between the mother and a quilt, the infant stayed warm through the radiant heat of the mother's body. This was not a perfect solution. Mothers fell asleep and risked dropping the child. The risk of overlay, of rolling onto the child, which was the common danger of bed sharing, was less severe in the chair position, but not zero. These were imperfect solutions to an impossible situation, and families navigated them the best they could. What the sitting position did for the adults who used it, beyond the immediate warmth of staying near the stove, was something more subtle that some families understood and some did not. A person sitting up, even slouched, maintains a slightly elevated head and chest relative to the horizontal sleeping position. In a cold, damp room, this elevation matters for drainage. The sinuses drain better, the lungs drain better. For people who had any chronic respiratory condition, and in rural America in this era, a significant portion of the adult population had lungs that had been compromised by dust, by illness, by hard winters past. This angle was not trivial. Old farmers with what they called the winter cough, which could be anything from chronic bronchitis to early emphysema to the aftermath of tuberculosis, often found that sitting up was the difference between getting through a cold night breathing reasonably well and spending it fighting for air. There is a reason that among the old-timers in these communities, the rocking chair by the stove was considered the rightful seat of the patriarch or matriarch of the household. It was not purely a symbol of authority or rest. It was the best seat for surviving winter. The beds themselves tell part of this story. If you have ever been to a museum of American folk life, or visited a restored farmhouse from the 19th or early 20th century, you may have noticed something odd about the beds. They are short. Not just narrow, but short from head to foot. Shorter than a modern bed. Shorter than a modern person. A full-size bed from a rural American farmhouse of the 1880s or 1890s might measure only 5 feet from head to foot, and occasionally less. For a long time, people assumed this reflected that people were simply shorter in the past, and it is true that average heights were somewhat lower, though not as dramatically lower as people often assume. But the short bed has another explanation, one that connects directly to the practice of sleeping sitting up and the general understanding of cold weather sleep. Short beds, combined with a bolster or a wedge of some kind at the head end, were designed to be slept in at an angle. You did not lie flat in a short bed. You piled up at the head end, half sitting, with your body angled rather than horizontal. This position was considered healthier by many people of the era, for reasons both accurate and inaccurate. A mix of genuine respiratory wisdom and folk belief that sleeping flat allowed bad humors or miasmas to settle into the body. The underlying folk belief was wrong, but the practical effect, keeping the chest elevated and the airways draining, was not wrong at all. The bolster, which was a long cylindrical pillow that ran the entire width of the head of the bed, was a standard piece of bedroom furniture in rural American homes well into the 1930s and 40s, and in some households much later. You propped yourself against the bolster and slept sitting up in your own bed. The bed was short because you did not need the full length of the bed if you were not lying flat. This practice was so normalized in some communities that lying flat in bed was considered unusual, even slightly suspicious. Old people in parts of Appalachia and the rural South would say that lying flat was sleeping like the dead, and there was a cultural weight to that phrase that went beyond mere superstition. Flat sleeping was what you did in your coffin. Sitting up, angled, propped against your bolster, was how the living slept. Edna Calloway, after the night she found Thomas with blue lips, never slept flat again in winter, not for the rest of her life. What she did was reorganize the bedroom. She and her husband Clyde, who worked at the small dairy operation they ran on 40 acres outside of Guernsey County, moved their bed against the wall nearest the kitchen, which shared a chimney with the kitchen stove and was therefore slightly warmer than the other walls by the conducted heat through the brick. She added an extra layer to the bolster, building it up higher so that she was sleeping at a steeper angle, almost 45 degrees. She moved Thomas and his younger sister Vera out of the separate bedroom entirely and put them on pallets on the kitchen floor on the coldest nights, which was considered perfectly acceptable and comfortable by the standards of the time. And she taught herself to make what she called the winter chair, which was her phrase for the particular arrangement of quilts and pillows that turned the kitchen rocking chair into an adequate sleeping station. She would put Thomas in the chair on nights when the outside temperature dropped below about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, wrap him from feet to chin in the double-thick quilt she had made from 2 old wool blankets stitched together, tuck a rolled-up feed sack behind his neck to prop his head, and let him sleep there until dawn. He slept in the chair. She slept on a pallet on the floor nearby, angled up on her own pile of quilts, watching the stove. Clyde thought she was overcautious. He had grown up in a family where you slept in bed and that was that, and if you were cold you put another blanket on, and that was the full extent of winter sleep strategy in his childhood household. He and Edna argued about it, civilly, the way farm couples argued about most things, which is to say they each stated their view, the other person stated their disagreement, and then they did it Edna's way because Edna was the one who had found Thomas with blue lips, and Clyde had not. Thomas grew up healthy. He grew up, in fact, to be a big man who worked the dairy farm until his 60s, outliving both his parents and most of his childhood contemporaries. He remembered sleeping in the rocking chair. He remembered it not as a hardship, but simply as a fact of winter. The way milking twice a day was a fact of life on a dairy farm, neither good nor bad, but simply what you did. The dairy farms of Ohio and Indiana and Wisconsin had their own specific relationship to the cold sleep problem, because dairy farming required people to be awake and functional at hours that were not conducive to having just gotten out of a warm bed. Milking, depending on the operation and the time of year, began somewhere between 4 and 5:30 in the morning. In winter, this meant getting up when the temperature outside was at its coldest point of the day, which in the upper Midwest could mean temperatures well below zero. A person who had been sleeping flat and warm under heavy quilts in a cold bedroom, dragged suddenly to full wakefulness and physical activity in the dark and the cold, was at some risk. Not of hypothermia necessarily, though that was not impossible, but of the slow start physical misery that made dawn milking in January feel like a genuine punishment. Dairy farmers who slept in the half-sitting position near the stove, or who had developed the habit of sleeping at an angle, often reported that they woke more easily, felt less of the jarring cold shock of transition, and moved into the work of the early morning with less difficulty. Whether this was physiological or psychological or some combination, the belief was real and widespread enough that it shaped habits across multiple generations of dairy farming families. The pattern was not unique to dairy. Hog farmers who did winter farrowing, which meant watching sows that were due to give birth in cold weather to ensure the piglets did not freeze, would sometimes spend nights in or near the hog barn, sleeping in the sitting position on bales of hay or on wooden benches they built into the farrowing pens. They were not trying to avoid cold bedrooms in this case. They were placing themselves where they needed to be to do the work, and sleeping in the position the work allowed, which was sitting. A farrowing operation in the 1940s and 50s was a serious and labor-intensive business. A sow in winter farrowing could produce a litter of 8 to 12 piglets, and in temperatures below freezing. Those piglets would begin to die within minutes of birth if they were not dried off, placed under a heat lamp if you had one, or held against a warm body until they could generate their own heat. A farmer sitting up through the night near a farrowing sow was doing something that had a direct and immediate dollar value. Piglets that survived were money. Piglets that froze were loss. You sat up. You watched. You slept when you could, in the chair or on the bale, and you were grateful for whatever sleep you got. There is a dimension to this story that lives in the women's history of farming, specifically that tends to get overlooked when people talk about old farm practices. The labor of keeping children alive through winter in a cold farmhouse was women's labor. It was invisible, meaning it was not recorded in the farm ledgers. It was not discussed in the agricultural extension pamphlets. It did not appear in the practical farming guides that the county agents distributed through the 1930s and 40s. What appeared in those guides was information about crop yields and animal health and soil amendments. The nighttime work of sitting with a sick child in a cold kitchen, adjusting the damper on the stove, listening for a change in a child's breathing, knowing from the sound whether to wake up all the way or whether it could wait. This was simply part of what mothers did. And because it was simply part of what mothers did, nobody wrote it down. We know it because of oral history. Because people who grew up in these households talked to their children about it. And some of those children talked to researchers. And because the women themselves, in the letters they wrote to sisters and cousins and the occasional diary they kept, left traces of this knowledge behind. A woman in Carroll County, Kentucky, writing to her sister in 1944, described a winter so cold that the water in the kitchen bucket froze solid in a single night even with the stove burning, and said that she had not slept in her own bed for 6 weeks, spending every night instead in the rocking chair, with the baby in her arms and the 2 older children on pallets at her feet. She called this winter keeping, and she described it not as extraordinary, but as simply what you did when the cold came hard. She asked her sister whether they had the same cold up in Indiana and whether she was doing the same. We do not have the sister's reply, but we can guess. The particular quality of cold that drove farm families to the sitting sleep practice was not just temperature. It was the combination of temperature and moisture. Rural farmhouses in the wetter parts of the country, the Ohio River Valley, the Mid-Atlantic Hill Country, the Piedmont of the Carolinas, the Ozark Plateau, dealt with a specific kind of winter cold that was harder on the body than the drier cold of the Great Plains. Damp cold gets inside you differently than dry cold. A 30-degree night in rural Kentucky, with fog sitting in the hollows, felt colder and more dangerous than a 10-degree night in western Kansas, with dry air and clear skies. This is not merely perception. Damp air conducts heat away from the body more efficiently than dry air, and damp cold in a poorly insulated house soaked into the walls and the floors and the blankets themselves in ways that dry cold did not. In the river valleys and the hollows, winter moisture was a constant companion. The fog would settle in overnight, and by morning every surface in an unheated room would be touched with condensation. Bedding that had seemed dry the night before would feel slightly damp by morning. Wood that had been stacked inside the house to keep it dry would be pulling moisture from the air. The walls themselves would be cold to the touch in a way that was not merely cold, but wet. And sleeping near those walls meant sleeping in a damp chill that ordinary quilts could only partly address. Families in these regions developed variations of the sitting sleep practice that specifically addressed the moisture problem. One common adaptation was to bring the sleeping pallets or chairs as far from the exterior walls as possible, centering the sleeping area around the stove not just for warmth, but for the slight drying effect the stove had on the air immediately around it. A family sitting in a ring around a hot stove in January was doing something that, if you explained the physics to a modern person, would sound perfectly sensible. They were placing themselves in the warmest, driest air available. They were positioning their bodies at angles that let their airways drain. They were using the radiant heat of the stove directly, rather than trying to store that heat in bedding and building materials that would lose it overnight. It was not comfortable. It was not the life anyone would have chosen, but it was effective, and it was what they had. One of the practical technologies that existed in many farmhouses and that made sitting up sleeping somewhat more tolerable was the foot warmer and the related variety of warming implements that farm families constructed and used with considerable ingenuity. A foot warmer in the most basic form was simply a container, often a small wooden box with pierced tin or metal sides that held a pan or brick of hot material, typically a coal from the stove or a fire-heated soapstone or a similar material. that could be placed at a person's feet and would radiate warmth for several hours. Foot warmers had been used in American rural life since the colonial period and were still in common use well into the 1940s and 50s in areas that lacked central heat. A person sleeping in a rocking chair with their feet on a foot warmer was significantly more comfortable than a person in the same chair without one. The feet are a critical heat loss point for the body. Keeping the feet warm allows the body to maintain core temperature more effectively, and core temperature maintenance is what allows sleep. A farm woman who had heated up her soapstone foot warmer before going into the chair for the night had solved a significant part of the cold sleep equation through a technology that had been working reliably for 200 years. Soapstone was particularly prized for foot warmers because it held heat longer than other stones and it held it evenly, without the hot spots that could burn through fabric. A good piece of soapstone heated on the stove before bed and wrapped in a piece of flannel would stay warm to the touch for 4 or 5 hours. In some families, the soapstone was an heirloom object, passed down through generations. The particular stone that had kept grandmother warm during the winter of the Great Blizzard of 1888, having been kept and used by every generation since. There were also bed warmers, which were long-handled metal pans with lids that you filled with hot coals and ran between the sheets of the bed before getting in, warming the bedding itself. These were used primarily in the cold bedroom situation rather than the sitting-up situation, and they were primarily for the adults who were actually sleeping in the beds. The children in the chairs by the stove did not need bed warmers. They had the stove itself. By the 1950s, things were beginning to change. Rural electrification, which had been moving through the American countryside since the Rural Electrification Administration was established under the Roosevelt administration in 1935, was reaching even the most remote farming communities by the early 50s. With electricity came electric space heaters, small and not particularly efficient but functional, that could be placed in a bedroom and turned on a few hours before sleep, warming the room enough to make flat sleeping in a bed a reasonable proposition. With electricity also came electric blankets, which appeared in the American market in the late 1940s and spread quickly through households that could afford them. An electric blanket was a revolution in cold weather sleeping. You could sleep flat in a cold room under a blanket that was generating its own heat, and you would wake up warm. The cold bedroom was suddenly a solved problem, at least for the families who had electricity and could afford the blanket. For those families, the sitting-up practice faded quickly. Within a generation, nobody in the household could remember clearly why their grandmother had spent winters in the rocking chair. It had simply been a thing she did, something about the cold, something about the children, and now they had the electric blanket, and it was fine. Propane came in the same era. The 1950s and 60s saw a dramatic spread of propane heating systems into rural areas, and with a propane furnace and a thermostat, you could have a house that maintained a livable temperature overnight throughout the winter, without anyone having to manage a wood fire. Farmers who had spent their childhoods getting up at 2 in the morning to reload the stove now had thermostats. Their children grew up not knowing that such a thing as a fire that needed reloading in the middle of the night had ever existed. Central heat, when it arrived in the old farmhouses, was experienced not as a convenience, but as a profound change in the fundamental conditions of existence. People who had lived through the cold bedroom winters, and the sitting-up winters, and the foot-warmer winters, and the carefully managed wood stove winters, described the arrival of central heat in terms that bordered on the religious. It was that much of a change. It was the removal of something that had been a constant grinding background fact of winter life, the management of cold, the negotiation with cold, the hourly and nightly battle against cold, and its replacement with a dial on a wall that you set once and then forgot. Edna Callaway got a propane furnace in 1956. Thomas, who was by then 18 years old and helping run the dairy, installed it himself over a long weekend in October before the cold came. Edna turned on the heat for the first time that November, walked through the house, touched each wall in each room, felt the warmth that the house was holding, and cried. She did not tell Thomas why she was crying. He did not ask. He understood. There is something worth sitting with in this story, something that goes beyond the historical curiosity of how people slept. And it is the question of what knowledge gets lost when circumstances change faster than memory can keep up. The families who practiced sitting up sleeping in the 1930s and 40s were not doing it because they thought it was charming or traditional or connected to some philosophy of life. They were doing it because it worked, because experience and observation and the hard school of childhood winters had taught them that it worked, and because the alternative was children with blue lips at 2 in the morning and the terrible arithmetic of deciding whether to wake up Clyde or whether it would pass on its own. That knowledge was real, it was practical, it was earned. And when the conditions that required it disappeared, the knowledge went with them, because there was no reason to pass it on. You do not teach your children how to manage a wood stove if you have a propane furnace. You do not teach your grandchildren about foot warmers and sleeping angles if they have electric blankets and thermostatically controlled bedrooms. But the knowledge itself has not become irrelevant. The reasons that sitting up worked are still true. Cold air still settles. Elevation still helps the airways drain. Body temperature management in a sleeping infant is still the same physics it was in 1942. The people who know this today are medical professionals who learned it from textbooks, not farm families who learned it from their grandmothers. The chain of transmission was broken by the furnace and the electric blanket, which is not a tragedy. It is simply what happens when problems get solved, but it is worth naming. There is something in the old farm knowledge that deserves to be remembered, even when the conditions that created it no longer exist. The people who figured out how to keep children alive through winters in cold, drafty houses without electricity or central heat were doing something remarkable. They were problem-solving under severe constraints, using nothing but accumulated observation, inherited wisdom, and the relentless pressure of necessity. And they were getting it right often enough that most of their children survived to have children of their own. Edna Callaway lived to be 83 years old. She died in the farmhouse in Guernsey County in 1989, by which time the farmhouse had had central heat for over 30 years, and the dairy operation had passed to Thomas's son, her grandson, who ran it with the help of a milking parlor that would have looked like science fiction to the Clyde and Edna of 1942. In the last years of her life, Edna would sometimes talk about the old winters. Not with nostalgia exactly, not with any sense that those winters had been better, because they had not been better. They had been hard in ways that left marks, but with a kind of ownership. She had known something that most people no longer needed to know. She had been competent at something that the modern world had rendered unnecessary, and there was a complicated feeling in that, something between pride and grief, between the satisfaction of having learned and the knowledge that what you learned was no longer asked for. She kept the rocking chair, the old kitchen rocking chair with the flattened runners and the curved back, and the arms worn smooth from decades of winter nights. She kept it in the corner of the main room, near where the stove had been before the furnace went in. She sat in it every day, not because she needed to, not because the cold demanded it, but because it was the chair she knew, because the body, even in comfort, remembers what the body learned in necessity. That chair is in Thomas's son's house now. Nobody in the family is quite sure why they have kept it. It is not particularly valuable. It is not particularly beautiful. It is just an old rocking chair, worn in particular places, with a character that new chairs do not have. But if you know what to look for, if you know what it was used for and why, you can see the knowledge in it. You can see the winters in it. You can see Edna in it, wrapped in her double quilt at 2 in the morning, the stove loaded heavy, the children sleeping on their pallets at her feet, everyone breathing in the warm center of a cold winter night, alive and breathing and making it through until morning. That is what the chair holds. That is what these families held. That is what this story is trying to say. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If this video brought back memories, or if you learned something you did not know before, that is exactly what this channel is here for. Please consider subscribing if you have not already. It really does make a difference, and it helps this channel keep telling these stories. Leave a like if this video was worth your time, and if you know someone who would appreciate it, share it with them. These are stories that deserve to be passed on. This video is inspired by real events, real historical practices, and real experiences from American farming communities during the 1930s through the 1970s. It does not represent or seek to offend any individual, family, or community. Edna Callaway is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farm women and farming families who faced these exact circumstances during this era. She is not a documented historical individual, but everything she does in this story is something that real people, in real farmhouses, in real winters actually did,